A recent surge in purple sea urchins off of the coast of Oregon seems to be having a negative effect on the biggest animals that feed there, gray whales. Welcome back to Tea of the Sea, and there is a population of gray whales along North America's coastline that choose to not migrate all the way up into the Bering Strait around Alaska and Russia during the summertime to feed. Instead, this small population of gray whales, referred to as the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, tends to stay along the coastline of Oregon and Washington State, feeding in and around the kelp forests on the coast. And it's not just the kelp forest that the gray whales are going to. They're feeding along the coast close to shore along Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. Now, for the last decade or so, we have been seeing a very significant and catastrophic shakeup of the seafloor ecosystem along North America's Pacific coastline in the form of the disappearance of sunflower sea stars. I've actually talked about this in a previous video way back last year, but Seastar Wasting Disease is when starfish effectively degrade while still alive, eventually dying because they're basically disintegrating. And this disease has destroyed the sunflower sea star population, where for the most part they're basically extinct in the wild. They aren't really extinct in the wild, but like 95% of the population is completely gone. Consequently, there have been areas that have been seeing a very large growth of purple sea urchins, which are the primary food source for sunflower sea stars. So now that the sea stars are gone, the urchins aren't being preyed upon in the amounts that they used to be, so they're growing out of control. When the sea urchin population explodes, the amount of kelp forest that we see begins to go down, because sea urchins, being bottom feeders, feed on the kelp and other seaweeds, and if there aren't a lot of predators to keep their numbers down, they eat too much of the kelp forests. And kelp forests are an incredibly important ecosystem. They provide shelter for a wide number of animals, as well as a critical habitat for even more animals, like zooplankton specifically. Zooplankton, which are tiny little animals, are the basis of the food chain. What feeds on them is fed on by larger animals, so on and so forth, all the way up to the big gray whales. Now, the dynamic between kelp forests and sea urchins is well documented and taught. I'm sure all of us remember learning about this back in grade school, but this study, which was released earlier this month, is the first of its kind to look beyond this relationship at the wider effects that sea urchins can have on kelp forest ecosystems. As a side note, I should also mention that the other predator to the purple sea urchins, sea otters, aren't in great abundance either due to overhunting during the fur trading years. So when the sunflower sea stars started to disappear about a decade ago, the whole ecosystem was effectively thrown out of whack, and we are now starting to see the results of that problem. So the team of researchers have been monitoring gray whale populations for the better part of a decade now, and they really started to notice, outside of the gray whales, kelp forest decline in 2018 and 2019, coinciding with a huge population burst of the purple sea urchins. And the team began to notice fewer and fewer gray whales appearing in the areas where they would normally frequent in 2020 and 2021. Alongside that, the gray whales that were there started to show signs of not being as well fed as they would have been in previous years. So there appears to be a correlation here. If the kelp forests suffer, the gray whales can also suffer shortly after. Now, the researchers aren't entirely sure how a decline of kelp forests leads to a decline of zooplankton, but they think it has to do with the plankton using the kelp forest as a form of shelter. It's also probable that the kelp forests simply keep the plankton in that area, as kelp forests are a good breakup of ocean currents and waves that would otherwise carry the plankton away from a concentrated area. This study highlights the impact that climate change specifically is having on our ecosystems around the world, not just in our oceans. Climate change has been attributed to the Seastar Wasting Disease pandemic that began back in 2015. It's believed that marine heat waves and warmer waters worsened the Seastar Wasting Disease pandemic, and kelp forests tend to do better in colder water, so if the water's warmer, you're not going to have as healthy of kelp forests. There is a little bit of good news, though. The area of study appears to be recovering as of 2023. Hopefully, this trend that appears to be beginning continues on, and the kelp forest can recover, because that brings the zooplankton back, and that brings the ecosystem and the iconic Pacific Coast gray whales back to Oregon's shores.